Try that again. Hey everyone, welcome back to our second panel of the day, Self-Care in Crisis. I think that, all aboard. I think that this panel should build really nicely on the first panel, particularly Dr. Cheng's presentation. And I'm delighted to be moderating a panel featuring three scholars whose work I all greatly admire. As we've been doing in previous panels, after we hear from the presenters, if you'd like to pose a question or if you have a comment, you can utilize the raised hand feature. The panelists can also see your comments in the chat if you wanted to join the queue. That way you can let me know in the chat. So first today we will hear from Dr. Ramya Pucha, who is an assistant professor in the Institute for Women's Studies and the Hugh Hodgson School of Music at the University of Georgia. Dr. Pucha's research interests center on post-Enlightenment colonial and anti-colonial thought, particularly around constructs of citizenship, race, gender, sexuality, the body, and the law. Professor Pucha received her PhD from the University of Chicago in 2011, and her first book, Mythical Courtesan Modern Wife, Disembodiment and Anti-Colonial Praxis in Transnational South Asia, develops a critical race and feminist approach to South Asian performance cultures. She's currently working on a project titled Yi Yi Nation, Public Universities, Country Music, and the Doublespeak of 21st Century White Supremacy, which examines expression of race, citizenship, and post-9/11 American cultural politics within higher education and country music publics. Dr. Pucha's second book project, Namaste Nation, Wellness, Cultures, and Orientalism in the 21st Century, extends her work on transnational South Asian performance cultures to critical analyses of capitalist fitness industries within legal and effective discourses of body, race, wellness, and citizenship. Next, we'll hear from Hi'ile Julia Hobart and Tamara Neese. Dr. Hobart is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. She received her doctorate from New York University's Department of Nutrition and Food Studies, and she also holds degrees in material culture studies and rare book librarianship. Her teaching and research focus on indigeneity and race, settler colonialism, food, and the Pacific. She's currently writing a book forthcoming from Duke University Press on the social history of ice in Hawaii from 1850 to 1980, which examines how cold temperature emerged as a taste quality of colonial power and leisure within the tropics. She's published articles in Food Culture and Society, Global Food History, Native American and Indigenous Studies, as well as other journals. She's edited a book on the foodways of Hawaii for Routledge, and most recently, she's co-edited a special issue of Social Text on the topic of radical care, identifying care as a practice of radical politics, with our final panelist, Dr. Tamara Neese, who is an assistant professor of media studies and the program director of gender and sexuality studies at the University of San Francisco. Dr. Neese received her PhD in media culture and communication from New York University, her MA in social sciences and anthropology from the University of Chicago, and her BA in anthropology from Kenyon College. Dr. Neese's research examines digital cultures using ethnographic and historical methods to understand emergent practices around labor, love, and loss. Her work has appeared in Catalyst, Feminist Theory, Technoscience, Cultural Studies, Feminist Media Studies, The New Inquiry, Public Books, Social Media and Society, as well as Social Text. And I can tell you that the article of hers that was just published in Social Media and Society, she really overcame some dead weight as a co-author on that one, namely me. She's currently writing a book for Yale University Press on the platform infrastructures of digital afterlives. And with that, please join me in welcoming all three of our panelists. And Dr. Pucha, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Thank you so much. All right, here we go. Wish me luck. How's that look? Okay. All right, well, thank you again for that introduction and for the opportunity to participate today. I am very honored to be here and very excited to be in conversation with my fellow panelists today. So my presentation today is based primarily on ethnographic and critical yoga studies research on wellness and self-care industries, and is excerpted from a larger project that interrogates entrenched connections between self-care, gender, and white supremacist thought in the US context. In the larger project, I argue that global North forms of engagement established during the colonial era and in the name of the so-called white man's burden have today become popular and legible as self-care through what is known as Instagram tourism, a form of performative travel to and in the global South. Today, I'll share with you just a small piece of the larger project, drawing from ethnography in the yoga studio. Within the larger project, I trace a genealogy of wellness and self-care that begins in the late 19th century and is tied to notions of purity, sanitation, women's bodies, and sexuality. For today, my argument in essence is that self-care industries, particularly yoga, are, in the contemporary moment, a version of what Black feminists like Hazel Carby identify as the cult of true womanhood. In a paradoxical yet not entirely surprising construction, my research shows that self-care industries, which are run for and by the Anglo-American demographic, are increasingly disconnected from the political agency and consciousness that Audre Lorde once identified as a radical form of resistance. My first day at the studio was a snowy Monday evening. I arrived with my colleague, a white woman in her 40s, and a dedicated yoga practitioner. Entering an otherwise unremarkable red brick building in the historic and gentrifying part of town, we walked up a steep flight of stairs above a French bakery and a luxury women's clothing boutique. As soon as I entered the reception area, I was greeted by the overwhelming scent of sandalwood incense, the faint sound of Sanskrit chant, a collection of bronze statues, and a wall of colorful and bright photos featuring Indian women and children. Scanning the photos for details that might help me locate where they were taken, I guessed somewhere in North India, judging by the terrain and the clothing the women were wearing. The photos were voyeuristic, intrusive almost, akin to the photojournalism popularized by the National Geographic over the past century, and most notable for framing previously colonized areas as barren and underdeveloped. Indeed, one photo in particular caught my eye. The young woman staring into the camera was framed in a way to bear a stark resemblance to the now famous photograph, Afghan Girl. Captured in 1985 by Steve McCurry, this photo has since come to signify the poverty pornographic connection many in the global North maintain with previously colonized areas. The owner of the studio, Elise, a white woman in her 40s as well, did not introduce herself, nor did she ask me my name, but she did earnestly inquire as I removed my shoes if I was Indian. Without waiting for an answer, however, she proudly pointed to the wall of photos, sharing with me that she had taken all of them herself during a recent trip to study yoga in India. She was animated and enthusiastic as she told me about how transformative the trip had been for her, how yoga had really helped her, quote, find herself and heal. Drawing my attention back to the photos, she said she had capitalized on the time she was in India to learn how to use her Nikon and to hone her amateur photography skills. We stood in silence in front of the photos for a few moments. I asked if she remembered their names, but she said she didn't know them. She had not asked, but she also didn't know how to. She did not speak their language. Photos like the ones this photo might remind us of, she said, are a way just to bring India back home with her. They were just souvenirs. It is by now a truism that photography and other forms of visual mobile art, which position South Asia as an Orientalist fantasy meant for consumption, reproduce what many have theorized as the white racial frame. In her work on the circulation of images in global North news media, Zeynep Gürsel refers to images like those found in magazines like National Geographic as, quote, indexed bodies, representing as they do an entire country's population. After all, for years after Sharbatgula was photographed by McCurry against her wishes, the photo did not identify her, but rather represented the war-torn region metonymically through her, as it often appears in the US racial and geographic imagination. An aggregate of what is portrayed as Afghanistan's timeless, almost naturalized plight of despair and poverty. In the 15 years I have been conducting ethnographic fieldwork in US yoga studios, images and sounds of India as a primordial spiritual space have appeared as a consistent tool in cultivating an affective tether for practitioners and consumers. In the studio I described earlier, the owner, Elise, an upper middle class lawyer and photography enthusiast, had traveled to India in the aftermath of an acrimonious divorce. She was part of a new era of white upper class female yoga enthusiasts in the aftermath of the 2006 best-selling novel by Elizabeth Gilbert titled Eat, Pray, Love. This book, part memoir, part travel diary, part self-help guide, reinvigorated a somewhat dormant but long-standing countercultural and escapist touristic relationship between the global North and South. Joining a larger body of work set in the global South in the post-September 11th era, the memoir particularly valorized yoga, but also alternative forms of spirituality and medicine as a means by which white women could, quote, find themselves, as well as claim their sexuality outside the confines of marriage. Feminist scholars like Shefali Chandra have noted the Orientalist logics at the heart of such engagements. Quote, skillfully navigating between 20th century imperial history, the rise of the war on terror, and a barely contained obsession with Hindu female sexuality, each of these texts is driven by the conviction that India and Indian women will heal the mind and the body of the white woman. India enables the white woman to cure herself, end quote. A recent tourism advertisement by Incredible India, the international campaign maintained by the government of India since 2002, animates such logics.
Come to the land of yoga, rejuvenate your soul. Experience India. India, incredible India.
Okay, I first saw this ad while I was in India, perhaps ironically enough, while I was running on a treadmill in New Delhi. Indeed, the advertisement is actually rarely broadcast on channels outside of India, with the exception of international CNN, which is where I saw it. The inspiration for the music in this ad is easily identifiable. The sonic landscape would be familiar to anyone who participates in commercial yoga industries in the US. The genre with which such music is categorized is known more generally today by the title of New Age. New Age music associated with the broader countercultural trends that popularized yoga and meditation in the 1960s and 1970s, and particularly in California, did not attract much industry attention until the 1990s. Since the 1990s, however, New Age artists have capitalized on the growth of the yoga industry by adopting the themes of spirituality and healing in particular. One New Age artist whose work is popular across the US yoga industry is actually a German artist who goes by the stage name Deva Premal. And I should note here that that is a name she's taken for herself, and Deva translates to God, so she named herself God. Premal spent time studying yoga in India and now credits herself with introducing what she calls the West to the power of Sanskrit mantra or chant. Through her music career, Premal is embedded in the yoga industry in the United States context and its Orientalist fascination with both Hinduism and Sanskrit. Her commercial success can arguably be attributed to one track in particular, her interpretation of the Gayatri Mantra, an important verse that originates in the Rig Veda and which first appeared on her 1998 album, The Essence. The track follows the conventions of New Age spiritual music in general, featuring a synthesizer and a drone-like texture, but Premal sings over this background and does so in a manner which eschews all conventions of Sanskrit pronunciation. And in the interest of time today, I'm actually not going to play it, but I can provide the link to it. It's on YouTube. Premal is not alone in this practice of drastically changing Sanskrit mantras for the yoga consumer market in the United States by arguing that such music is not geolinguistically grounded in any way, and therefore she need not follow any conventions of vocalization. Since at least 1998, the yoga industry has exploded worldwide under this logic of spiritual, but not from a certain place and not religious. And especially in the era of streaming music, there is an ever-present demand for music like Premal's, which, and this is a quote from her, from the back of her most recent CD, which boasts a 5,000-year tradition that predates religion and also claims magical healing powers for its listeners. A recent review of Premal's new self-titled album builds on this trend, now describing the sounds as, quote, sensual mantra medicine. It seems of no consequence, however, to fans of Premal or her fellow New Age artists like Snatam Kaur, who performed at the 2019 Grammy Awards ceremony during the pre-televised programming. Neither artist seems to believe that it matters if they use language in any way that might allow it to be intelligible. Much like Premal, Kaur's pronunciation departs from all accepted forms of Sanskrit pronunciation and instead relies on a combination of costuming and performative spectacle. In both of these cases, it is clear that it matters little whether or not the Sanskrit mantras are, in fact, in Sanskrit, since the language is arguably altered beyond a point of comprehension. In other words, the healing or care potential of the sound is secondary to the touristic and extractive logic that claims and sells ownership over such forms of power. For example, here is the latest 2018 installment of the Incredible India tourism campaign. So 2 things to remember here. Maharani means queen, and Incredible India is a tourism initiative under the government of India.
What does luxury mean to you? Luxury. In India, I discovered that true luxury isn't something you buy off a shelf. True luxury is a feeling that you are the Maharani of your world. And it can be all designed around you. All the beauty is yours. music is yours. India showed me that luxury doesn't follow designers and brands. True luxury follows its own heart.
Incredible India.
So just to wrap up, what becomes clear if one listens carefully to the rhetorical slippage between the sights and sounds of India constructed by and now for global North artists and travelers is that it is not India, but a version of India. What Pavitra Prasad has described in her work on tourism as a racially motivated nostalgia that brings white consumers, particularly women, to the subcontinent. Nostalgia, which can also be coded as self-care or wellness in spaces like the ones New Age music and tourism occupy, is in some ways quite a civil term for what is really happening in these moments. Arguably, white yoga industries have led many to a misunderstanding of what it means to care for the self. In the hands of whiteness, self-care has been elevated to a neoliberal ideology of virtue, which positions the self in opposition to both the other and the collective. In other words, rather than learning how to identify the way power shapes our everyday lives, which was, after all, the context in which Audre Lorde spoke of caring for the self as an act of political warfare, self-care cultures like yoga today appear to be peddling avoidant narcissism as a path to enlightenment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pucha. That was fascinating and so engaging. Great way to start off the panel. Without any other or further ado, let me turn it over to Drs. Hobart and Neese.
Thank you so much, Dr. Palm. It's really nice to meet you. So Tamara and I, we are kind of presenting together. What we'll do is we will co-talk about our Radical Care project together, and then to wrap that up, we will each spend a little bit of time talking about how we've thought about our shared intellectual project in our own independent research. So I am going to begin talking about Radical Care. This shared portion of our talk is based upon the introduction that Tammy and I co-wrote for our Radical Care special issue social text, in which we wanted to think critically about care, its labor, and its liberatory potential. When we drafted that introduction, which was concluded about a year ago, we were compelled by the discourses of care and self-care that seemed to respond to the political mandates of the Trump administration, the border crisis with its tender age camps, the hollowing out of social services, the rolling back of trans and women's rights, and so on. Between that time and now, the phenomenon that some are calling the crisis of care has become more visible, more acute. More recently, the disproportionate burdens that the current global pandemic has placed on food workers, custodial staff, doctors and nurses, teachers and mothers have laid bare a truth that those who do the labor of care are the most undervalued and simultaneously the most essential workers. As Nancy Welch recently put it, a social reproductive lens and the necroeconomics of who is afforded and who is denied conditions of care brings sharply into view that this pandemic is no equalizer. We are not in this threatened and vulnerable together. A recent surge in forms of collective and community care, including myriad mutual aid projects across the country that have emerged to alleviate the social inequities of first the novel coronavirus and now the Black Lives Matter movement's reinvigoration, compel us to parse carefully through the differences between, on the one hand, neoliberal calls for self-care, and on the other, the forms of care that support radical movements for social justice. We too are inspired by the reflections of Angela Davis, who in a recent interview explicitly tied social change to care, stating that, quote, "I think our notions of what counts as radical have changed over time. Self-care and healing and attention to the body and the spiritual dimension, all of this is now a part of radical social justice struggles, and that wasn't the case before." In stating this, Davis points to a growing awareness that individual impulses and interior lives, the intimate and banal details of family histories and personal experiences, are directly connected to external structural forces. Care is then fundamental to social movements. While the phenomenon of care as political warfare has a long genealogy, it has taken on fresh significance in the past 6 months as the work of care has been stretched to a crisis point. The crisis of care emerges in part from the conceptualization of care itself, which tends to obscure its labor. Philosophers like Adam Smith and David Hume have identified care as empathy, sympathy, or fellow feeling, a kind of affective connective tissue between an inner self and an outer world. And herein also lies the challenges of care. When people use the phrase labor of love, they're employing the rubric of care to rationalize the lack of compensation for their work. Emotional fulfillment becomes payment enough. While recognizing the pervasive use of care as an imperative for any number of social and personal concerns, both valued and undervalued, our focus here is on the instances when care is employed against immediate crises and uncertain futures. When mobilized for social justice movements, radical care offers visceral, material, and emotional heft to acts of preservation that span a breadth of localities, selves, communities, and social worlds. Radical care for us exists in the ways that communities seek to remediate the corporeal and emotional tolls of structural inequity and disenfranchisement. For our purposes, we define it as a set of vital but underappreciated strategies for enduring precarious worlds. While radical care is often connected to positive political change by providing spaces of hope in dark times, we simultaneously acknowledge the negative affects associated with care. So because radical care is inseparable from systemic inequality and power structures, it can also be used to coerce subjects into new forms of surveillance and unpaid labor to make up for institutional neglect, and even to position some groups against others, determining who is worthy of care and who is not. Even so, in the face of state-sanctioned violence, economic crisis, and impending ecological collapse, we think collective care offers a way forward. Our framing of care as a critical survival strategy responds to two emergent strains of care discourses that are coincident but vastly different. On the one hand, self-care has been positioned as both a solution to and a symptom of the social deficits of late capitalism. Hashtag treat yourself becomes a remedy for hyperproductivity and the inevitable burnout that follows, commoditized in the form of special diets, therapy, gym memberships, and schedule management that individuals are tasked to purchasing and managing themselves. On the other hand, a recent surge of academic interest in care and its metonyms reflects how the urgency of care within our current political and socio-technical moment sits at the forefront of philosophical questions about who cares, how they do it, and for what reason. Following recent theoretical interventions into the importance of self-care despite its susceptibility to neoliberal co-optation, calls to vapid consumption and association with a wellness ideology, we want to extend the potentialities of self-care outward to include other forms of care that push back against structural disadvantage. And I'm going to hand the baton over to Tammy now.
Thank you. So to pick up right where Hihile left off, I will say, importantly, radical care is a form of collective political action. It is necessarily connected to on-the-ground social justice movements, even if the work itself is carried out by and on behalf of individuals. What are the care strategies used by individuals and groups across historical periods and in different parts of the world when institutions and infrastructures break down, fail, or neglect? Reciprocity and attentiveness to the inequitable dynamics that characterize our current social landscape represents the kind of care that can radically remake worlds that exceed those offered by the neoliberal or post-neoliberal state, which has proved inadequate in its dispensation of care. Radical care fills in for institutional neglect or even malevolence. This may sound like a naive proposition, particularly given the precarious circumstances that are culminating in our current moment, when crisis and disaster are the relentlessly pervasive frameworks through which, for some, redemption is not recognized as imminent or expected as forthcoming. Despondence and disorientation are rational outcomes. But despite such unavoidable circumstances, we find hope in locating spaces and enactments of care. Specifically, mobilizations of care allow us to envision what anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli describes as an otherwise. It is precisely this audacity to produce, apply, and affect care despite dark histories and futures that its radical nature emerges. Radical care can present an otherwise, even if it cannot completely disengage from structural inequalities and normative assumptions regarding social reproduction, gender, race, class, sexuality, and citizenship. As a framework, radical care can help to locate and analyze the mediated boundaries of what it means for individuals and groups to feel and provide care, survive, and perhaps even dare to thrive in environments that challenge their very existence. Since the time that Audre Lorde wrote A Burst of Light in 1988, in which she wrote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare," those frequently quoted words have become a mantra, appearing stitched on Etsy throw pillows and perhaps used in places like yoga studios. But Lorde's original context and meaning offers a way of reminding ourselves that self-care is necessary for collective survival within a world that renders some lives more precarious than others. Within the larger passage where Lorde describes her ordeals with cancer, and particularly her experiences as a Black lesbian interacting with the medical establishment, she conjures up images of Black activists coursing through her veins as they fight against colonial powers. She connects the anonymity of cancer to governmental neglect, and she jettisons the individualism of Foucault's mode of self-care in favor of coalitional survival. The fact that this quote is often presented without its original context and its popular usage tells us much about the difference between radical and neoliberal modes of self-care. Radical care is the kind of self-care that has been co-opted by neoliberal imperatives to treat yourself, but is instead a way of understanding a self which is grounded in particular histories and present situations of violence and vulnerability. The genealogy of radical care is thereby aligned with the emergence of self-care, but certainly not contained by it. Within this formulation, the self is not a generic philosophical self or subject, but a situated self engaged in complex sets of relations. And as I will touch on later, there's a much longer intellectual trajectory of feminist self-care and Black and brown activist work, both of which have been aimed to fill in the gaps produced through structural breakdown, failure, and neglect. With care re-entering the zeitgeist as a reaction to today's political climate, in which white supremacy and authoritarianism are out in the open, and during the COVID-19 crisis especially, radical care as a concept engages histories of grassroots community action and negotiates neoliberal models for self-care. Studies of care thereby prompt us to consider how and when care becomes visible, valued, and necessary within broader social movements. Rather than romanticizing care or ignoring its demons, radical care is built on praxis. Care is essential but undervalued labor, and watching children or cooking meals are as much a part of radical social movements as marching in the streets or giving speeches. And today, in a moment of acute and still unfolding crisis, as the historically undervalued labor of caring becomes recognized as a key element of individual and community resilience, radical care provides a roadmap for an otherwise.
So I'm going to pick up here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways that our conceptualization of radical care has been iterating into my work. And so I'm going to share kind of some thoughts in process about that. So if you just give me a moment to share my screen, I'll have some images to share with you. And if you just give me 1 second. I have to figure out how to share with you and also be able to see my text. Give me one more shot at this. For some reason, when I started this or tested it out, I could you know what? I might not be able to see my text and share my screen at the same time. So I apologize. You'll just have to hear me talk. Okay, so I'm going to take a turn sharing how I've been folding our shared intellectual project into my own research and writing. And I think of myself predominantly as a food scholar. So I've been recently thinking about radical care in terms of land-based pedagogies through which indigenous philosophies of care become articulated. In Hawaii, for Kanaka Maoli, this is commonly expressed through the guiding principle of aloha aina. And you saw that illustrated a bit in the slide that was up really briefly. And so aloha aina can be translated loosely into care for that which feeds. But you can also see in the layered meanings of I, the base word, that I translates into food, but it also translates into governance, right, to rule. And so it's a base word that connects importantly to self-determination and to sovereignty. As Native Hawaiian scholar Noelani Goodyear Ka'opua writes, aloha aina expresses an unwavering dedication to the health of the natural world and a staunch commitment to political autonomy. Oh, you can see your text and share your screen at the same time if you move to a different window and pause the share. You know what? Thank you so much, Chloe. I'm just going to continue because I'll otherwise take up too much time. As both are integral to a healthy existence. Although it is often imperfectly translated to love for the land and patriotism, the aloha of this part of the phrase is an active verb, a practice rather than as merely a feeling or a belief. So in this way, political sovereignty becomes bound up with care as an active and an ongoing practice. The philosophical stakes of such an approach pushes back against models of capitalist production rooted in the emergence of the plantation, slave labor, and the food system's industrialization. And these foundations have reverberated into today's global precarity. Donna Haraway uses the term plantationocene to describe our current era of anthropogenic climate change, explaining that, quote, the capacity to love and care for a place is radically incompatible with the plantation. And this positioning of care really resonates with me, which I take to mean that the scale, force, and discipline of the plantation is antithetical to the making of food systems, ecological systems, and a society that does not operate upon exploited labor. In Hawaii, aloha aina as a practice is used to create aina momona, which is basically a fat land, an abundant land. So the practice becomes reciprocal, collective, and interdependent. To think through the urgent project of anti-colonial, anti-capitalist abundance, I've been paying closer attention to what shorelines might offer a philosophy or praxis of radical care. So as seafaring people, as oceanic people, aloha aina for Hawaiians is not solely terrestrial. And here I've been thinking alongside Pacific Islander and Black and Caribbean thinkers who have been theorizing spaces between land and ocean. So Tiffany King Scholes, Kamau Brathwaite's Tidalectics, Christina Sharp's Wake, Vince Diaz's use of Pukov and Itak, and so on, in which the shallows or the tidal zones operate as more than metaphors for articulating the limits of state power for differentially racialized indigenous peoples. And these spaces frequently coded as Black and brown, their interstitiality underpins theories of not only liminality, but also agency, adaptation, flow, and interconnection. When Christina Sharp tells us that, quote, living in the wake of slavery is living the afterlife of property, She gestures at once to the containment logics that have structured settler capitalism, but also to the shallows that are carved into those wakes, in which care becomes the praxis of survival. She makes apparent that the shallows, wakes, and shoals are not a place, but a temporal condition of submerging and resurfacing through water, both fertile and capricious. Shoreline spaces hold possibilities for reconciling the terrestrial violence of indigenous dispossession against the oceanic transport of racialized labor required for monocropping stolen lands. To place this into the Hawaiian context, we might think of the Muliwai, a space that could be called an estuary, where shoreline dynamics are best theorized. And here I wish I had an image to show you quickly, but what you'll have to imagine is just an estuary as best you can. It's not only where land and water mix, but also where different kinds of water mix. So it's where watersheds coming from mountaintops will meet the saltwater of the sea. So we might think of the example of native Hawaiian fish ponds, which are a really crucial component of ancient community-based land management systems that use natural watersheds to support independent food systems. The fish pond in the Muliwai sits at the terminus of this system. So it sits at the very end of the shoreline. At the Muliwai, sea and river mingle together to produce the brackish conditions that tenderly support certain plant and aquatic lives, edible plants and small fish that replenish natural resources. It acts kind of like a nursery. Muliwai is not fixed, but as things that are alive, it moves and it breathes. As Philip Scorch and Noel Kahanu explain, the Muliwai ebbs and flows with the tide, changing shape and form daily and seasonally. In metaphorical terms, the Muliwai is a location and a state of dissonance where and when two potentially disharmonious elements meet, but it is not a space in between. Rather, it is its own space, a territory unique in each circumstance, depending on the size and the strength of a recent hard rain. To redefine their description a bit, the Muliwai might be better characterized not as a space, but instead as a conditional state. Muliwai expand and contract, withhold and deluge, nurture and sweep clean. It is not what theorists of state power might refer to as a space of exception. Rather, it is where we are reminded that places are never fixed or pure or static. Chamorro poet Craig Santos Perez reminds us in his critique of American territorialism that, quote, territorialities are shifting currents, not irreducible elements. And so if fixity and containment limit by design how futures might be imagined beyond plantation legacies, then the Muliwai has been helping me envision decolonial spaces as ones of tenderness, care, and interdependence. And this opens up for me what land-based pedagogies offer our vision of radical care and its potential to help us survive precarious worlds. And I'll stop there and I'll hand it over to Tammy.
Hey, so how are we doing on time? Just so I can kind of speed through stuff. I'm not.
Plenty of time.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to attempt to share images, and if it doesn't work, it's totally fine. Not needed. You know what? For whatever reason, it's not popping up. It's totally fine. We don't need it. We don't need to look at my weird archival images that were self-indulgent, perhaps, more than about radical care in this moment. So I will just read. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the tensions within care, and especially self-care, given the panel, which can be heightened during moments of crisis. In general, my work focuses on the ways that embodied material caretaking can intersect with digital platforms and infrastructures. So one example would be caring for somebody who has cancer, which can entail things like changing colostomy bags, performing domestic labor, or cooking meals for the family. Might also entail helping them manage their digital belongings, like their illness blog or social media accounts when they're sick. And then after they die, maintaining connections to an entire network. And I think about the ways that commercial platform infrastructures interact with social reproduction and even elements of the transcendent or sacred. Along those lines, we may think about care in relation to commercialism and collectivity. So going back to that sort of post-2016 moment when self-care started being used as a way of, coping with the election of Trump, and how often that was framed in terms of personal pleasures and satisfactions through the lens of purchases, such as buying a green smoothie or getting a massage. But self-care, as we have delineated, is also a way of fighting against activist burnout and a means of giving marginalized people strength. So within this presentation, I'll focus a little bit on the duality of self-care and how it emerges within some of my own work. So some aspects of self-care as self-help and as a kind of productivity training within the US especially date back to at least the 19th century. And I've done quite a bit of archival research on this particular group called the Life Extension Institute, which was founded in 1913 in New York. And it was an organization comprised of elite, white, wealthy men who were part of the life insurance industry and the medical establishment. And they put out a number of public health pamphlets and eventually a book called How to Live, which instructed people on how to extend their lives through health regimens. Their goal was enhanced worker productivity, a way for employers and insurance companies to maximize profits. The Life Extension Institute partnered with Ford Motor Company and insurance companies like MetLife and Prudential to surveil and monitor industrial workers, calculating how much labor they could extract from them before they were too exhausted to perform. It's important to note also that these folks were all eugenicists. The Life Extension Institute was founded on white supremacy. They categorized workers according to age and disability and by ethnic and racial category. You can see traces of the relationship between employers and insurers and productivity within corporate wellness programs and insurance startups that offer you a free Fitbit to better track your movements. In How to Live, there's an entire section on deep breathing as a way of achieving mindfulness, a version of which exists today in mindfulness apps, which can be connected to workers' devices or even their bodies through wearables and monitor their behaviors over time, whether they're on the clock or not. Take some time out to be a better worker. Remember to breathe, or let an app on your phone or your Apple Watch remind you to do so. The Mayo Clinic also provides self-care during COVID tips, including references to such mindfulness apps. As if caring for oneself can do away with the horrors of the world, rampant social inequality, and the necropolitics of everyday life. Self-care is presented as a way of managing mortality. If you can recall the beginning of COVID, and when publications like the Wall Street Journal and others were asking readers to take better care of themselves in order to prevent illness, get a lot of sleep, eat right, cut down on alcohol, as if that would somehow protect them from the virus. Never mind the essential workers like bus drivers and Amazon warehouse workers and others who had to continue to expose themselves every day. But on the other hand, there are also radical histories of self-care within the feminist movement in the 1970s, which Michelle Murphy delineates in her book, Seizing the Means of Reproduction. Rather than taking male medical practitioners at their word, women took a more DIY approach to their care. They learned about their bodies through hands-on tutorials at living room meetings. Maybe you've seen old copies of Our Bodies, Ourselves floating around, or images from the gynecological self-exams. Radical care as self-care moved from DIY activist circles back into the mainstream. Now self-exams for breasts are standard, as are self-care prescriptions as ways of coping with illnesses like cancer, with depression, grief, postpartum depression, or other moments of personal and collective crisis. A digital form of this kind of self-care and self-knowledge manifests in technologies like pregnancy tracking apps, which allows people to follow their own symptoms and trust their own bodies. At the same time, it is outsourcing care to an app in order to make up for a lack of real medical care. It is also a form of surveillance. Many of these apps are owned by startup companies, which are often controlled and funded by white men. Other aspects of this kind of feminist reclaiming of self-care over medical knowledge exists in the resurgence of midwifery and doula care for birthing people and similar practitioners in death care, who are also called death midwives or death doulas. The DIY death movement or death positivity movement is linked to these feminist histories. Groups like Radical Death Studies Collective work to decolonize death care, focusing on the death ways of people of color and marginalized groups. Self-care and radical movements around health and mortuary care are gaining traction during COVID-19. Methods of birth and death care, for instance, usually involve close embodied interactions with the birthing, dying, or dead person. Anthropologist Stephanie Chevenuto is a doula based in Brooklyn, and she specifically cares for people of color who are giving birth. She notes that Black maternal and infant mortality rates are so high that having this kind of attention, this one-on-one sort of framing, helps mitigate, to some extent, structural medical racism. Because of COVID-19 restrictions around hospitals, New York at one point had made birthing people go through labor alone. Doulas had to connect with their clients over FaceTime or Zoom, providing comfort in this mediated way instead of through massage, touch, or other acts of care connected to proximity. Similarly, writing in Jewish Currents, a death care worker who would ordinarily ritually bathe the dead had to perform the Jewish washing ritual via Zoom. In a time of crisis, medical workers are now helping dying people FaceTime their loved ones, performing end-of-life care that would ordinarily be done by family members or by hospice workers. This can take a toll on the people doing this work. The history of self-care is also, importantly, related to therapists and others working with trauma patients. How can you make sure that you are whole enough to care for others? Mediated care cannot replace embodied care work, but it's the best that people can do under these circumstances. Recently, a Black death care worker, Alua Arthur, was interviewed in the LA Times. Arthur is a death doula focusing on providing comfort to Black families. In a crisis that is disproportionately killing Black people, Arthur is using her knowledge to see people off with dignity. She says, "In my work, I advocate for the whole person. I'm honoring the person for exactly who they are and where they are at. It's activism cloaked in compassion. To me, that's an act of revolution." The article is accompanied by photos of Arthur preparing a rose petal bath as part of her self-care ritual. To do the hard and essential labor of caring for the dying, the dead, and their kin, she must also care for herself. As I wrote about in a recent article in Real Life magazine, crowdfunding contains some aspects of the more radical, collective possibilities of care, as well as the demands to care for oneself as a neoliberal call for self-reliance. Crowdfunding on GoFundMe or Kickstarter stands in for universal healthcare or life insurance coverage. It's used to make up for institutional and state neglect, and it relies on charitable individuals' donations to pay for people's hospital stays, surgery, or their funerals after they die. Basically, the US government has told people, go fund yourself. Often, kin members initiate these campaigns, circulate them, and do the work of attracting attention to them. However, crowdfunding is also increasingly part of mutual aid efforts, which focus on communities helping themselves and putting their own needs first. It's about giving direct material support rather than going through charitable organizations. If people don't feel safe gathering in the streets, either because of their own vulnerabilities or caretaking responsibilities, then crowdfunding provides them with a way of contributing and engaging in mutual aid practices from afar. Distributing food to people who need it, childcare collectives, sending out masks to protesters. All kinds of mutual aid efforts are connected to corporate crowdfunding platforms, payment systems like Cash App, Venmo, and PayPal, and even websites that are typically evil, like Nextdoor. That tension within care and the relationship between self-care and collective movements is not going anywhere, and it's being intensified by the current crisis. The hope may be that apps intended for productivity and surveillance give way to more radical social movements around caring for the self and for others.
Everyone, please join me in thanking all three of our panelists for really engaging and fascinating presentations. And while I'll just remind you again that if you have a question you want to pose, you can utilize the raised hand feature, or you can chat with me privately or with the panelists. If you're having internet issues or anything like that, and if you want to post your question in the chat, that's also fine. I'd be happy to read it if it's not visible to everyone. And while we're collecting some questions and folks are composing their questions, I've been kind of steeling myself to resist the urge to like dominate with a million questions as the moderator, but I just want to note that I see at least a couple like through lines through the conference so far, kind of intersecting in this paper. I think the papers themselves intersect and there's some really interesting connections as well as tensions between them. And I think, you know, going back to Tyler's paper that kicked us off yesterday through Dr. Levina's paper this morning, there's a really interesting thread about how concepts like care become, you know, the sites of cultural politics and racialized politics, maybe with a detour through Dr. Edelman's presentation yesterday about resiliency and who can lay claim to that or be, you know, bestowed with that title. Also, I think Monet Marshall's presentation yesterday about self-care and William Chang's comments this morning too provide a really interesting you know, set of questions that we can put into conversation here too. And I see that William Chang is still with us. So I'd like to invite you to engage in a question. Also invite the panelists to ask each other questions. And even though I know not everyone has been able to attend all of the panels, just want to note some of those, you know, some of those commonalities and trajectories that are emerging for me. And yeah, and invite you all to let her rip. Well, my friend and colleague, Dr. Silva, has started things off with a great question in the chat for Dr. Pucha. Maybe while you're reading that, Dr. Pucha, and gathering some thoughts about it, I'll read it for the attendees who may not be able to see it. After thanking everyone for their wonderful presentations and noting some of the overlaps, this is a question for Dr. Pucha, although Drs. Neese and Hobart may also have something to add. Dr. Silva is wondering, Dr. Pucha, whether you've engaged in conversations or even experienced conversations where mysticism is made explicit in these yoga spaces. And Dr. Silva notes that she sees a lot of parallels between the general practice of rendering previously colonized spaces as mystical or supernatural and the practice of claiming specifically that Black people are magic. And while she understands, excuse me, the politics of the use of magic for the communities themselves as empowering, the use of it by other communities to show care, for Dr. Silva at least, seems to mark Black and brown bodies as forms of extraterrestrial beings rather than strong communities with the knowledge and experience of self-governance. So a lot to engage in there from all three panelists, but if you're ready to jump in, Dr. Pucha, I'll turn things over to you.
Yeah, so first, thanks for the question, and I know it's fine. Sorry for the dissertation. Dr. Silva says I'm very excited to be on this panel. By the way, I've read the special issue of Social Text, and so when I saw your names, anyways, I'm just super excited to be here. So yes, I love this question. I'm very excited to hear what my co-panelists have to say to it. I will just quickly answer. I have come across it. It takes different shapes, this idea of the magic or the alien body or the primordial body. Like, it shows up in a lot of different ways. And when I have talked to, like in my ethnographic work, usually that conversation it's almost like the inverse of the white savior mechanism. So it's a way of understanding these spaces as somehow endowed with something that is more healing than their current state of being might be, but it's also very cartographic, right? And I have the presentation I gave today is a very sort of like shortened version of an article I have coming out in Tourist Studies. And the title of that article is actually Cartographies of Salvation, because I'm talking about this idea that I'm working with transnational feminist approaches that talk about cartographies of knowledge and power production. So Chandra Mohanty and Jackie Alexander's work is what I'm referring to in that article. But I have a lot of things to say about this idea of magic, because it is about placing bodies into a different category and making them, on the one hand, like resources, but dehumanizing them in the same way. And so in these tourism videos, one of the things that I find fascinating and puzzling in equal measure is that the Indian government knows that that is a ploy that they can use and sell. So they are using this idea that India is somehow a mystical place of healing, and they're selling that idea back to the very people who in some ways produced that notion a couple hundred years ago. So it's very circular. You know, you can't disentangle in this moment the effects of colonialism on the way that India and Hindu nationalists in power in India are then selling that idea back. I mean, it's very consumptive, it's circular, and I will just stop and say that Hindu nationalism, you cannot distinguish Hindu nationalism from the forces of colonialism. Like they are co-constitutive in a lot of ways right now. So I'll stop there, but thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Silva, for kicking us off, and Dr. Pucha for that answer. Doctors Hobart and Neese, anything to address on that question before we hear from some other folks?
I'm fine with sort of letting other people ask questions. I don't want to.
Okay, super. Next in the queue is one of our brilliant MURAP scholars for this summer, and I'm particularly psyched to hear from Sophia, who has been asking brilliant questions in our weekly seminars all summer, and she also has a question for Dr. Pucha.
Yes, thank you. This is sort of piggybacking on Dr. Silva's question. You mentioned about like white saviorism. So I was wondering if these women who engage in yoga and this mystical ideas that they're engaging is in a form of white saviorism, or specifically white savior feminism, like this idea that because I'm engaging in yoga or this spiritual culture that I am saving brown people, I'm saving this country, or I'm saving brown women.
Oh yeah, 100%. That is absolutely something. So that photograph I showed you that was a reference to Nat Geo. If you pay attention in some of these yoga studios where these women are also selling yoga tourism retreats, which has become a very common occurrence. So those retreats are in Bali or Costa Rica, or they tend to be somewhere tropical, but also someplace where people can sort of be in a secluded retreat environment and not actually have to interact with, the locals, if you will. You see a lot of photographs where people do leave those retreats and then go take a picture with like the brown baby or like the black baby. So there's a type of, and I've written about this a lot, actually. Let me take this opportunity to plug my website, because I talk about this project that's in progress. And in particular, the way that Instagram has become a place where people go do this yoga retreat. They take these pictures, they strike these poses, and then they write some sort of like crazy, humble, braggy caption for it. And it has connected white saviorism with the idea of care on the one hand, but it's also connected white saviorism with a form of feminism. And to sort of disentangle that is, I will tell you very, very, very candidly, like when I've tried to have these conversations in these yoga studio spaces, it has gone terribly for me. So I have to be very careful with how I engage in those conversations, because it's perceived as like an attack, and to call the response I get to that white fragility is entirely too facile. But it is a very complicated place where this idea that women's bodies are not cared for in our society, right? That women do not receive the care, women of all walks of life do not receive the kind of care that they require. And so they are called to this Orientalist fantasy to seek that care. And in the process, they get to sort of perform their own sense of superiority. Scholars have referred to that as imperial feminism. And there's a very large discourse around how white women might go to places like India to study yoga and then perform their white supremacy there. So yes, I definitely think that the white savior piece of it is a larger, it's a larger conversation. Thank you.
I just want to jump in very, very quickly to say that I see a lot of resonances between that and surf tourism and ecotourism and surf retreats, in the ways that they get connected to like ecological restoration and a white sense of obligation to like save whatever pristine wilderness they're going to go see without particular care or attention to the indigenous people who live there. A lot of really, really interesting intersections there.
Thank you both for that dialogue. We have a couple more questions coming in to the queue, and the panelists can read those. So again, I'll read them out for all of the attendees while the panelists are absorbing them and gathering some thoughts. First, I'm delighted to see Tyler ask a question because his presentation has been resonating for me throughout this entire panel, and even with just Dr. Hobart's last comments, thinking about the rewilding he was discussing yesterday. So his question is, Tyler's question is for Dr. Neese, asking in her examination of how wellness apps use people's personal information to curtail their adherence to labor and productivity. How can people maintain the sovereignty of their information while still participating in the benefits of technological advances to make these kinds of benefits more accessible? And next up, we have a question from Mimi for Dr. Pucha, but first let's hear from Dr. Neese and perhaps Dr. Hobart as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, there are movements like our data ourselves and sort of ways of tactically using wearables or the quantified self movement and all of those technological affordances in order to better understand the self. But I think the fundamental problem is that when you're dealing with corporate platforms and devices that are leaky sort of inherently, it's going to be very, very difficult to disentangle your data from those corporate owners. And also the fact that all of your data is contingent on your relationships with others, other actors in the world who are human, but also the different environments and objects that you encounter every day. So, you know, even writing BART in the Bay, so BART came to mind. But riding the subway, riding the bus in a smart city, that data, no matter what, you know, if you're carrying your phone around with you, it's going to be tracking you. And so even, you know, maybe one approach would be actually to do an old school version of self-tracking. There's been, you know, a way of quantifying the self through journaling and food diaries and, you know, different ways of keeping track of your own information in a very lo-fi way through paper records. And in some ways that might actually be more foolproof and more sound, just because of the obsolescence of all of our devices and our data storage capacities. I mean, you know, if you're uploading stuff to the cloud, you know, good luck making sure that it doesn't end up somewhere else in the future.
I think everyone can see Mimi's question for Dr. Pucha. Which feminists would you advise students of color to read to engage with introductory feminism?
Yes, and I just realized that in my excitement to respond to her, I just sent it to her privately, and I don't know how to, I guess I could cut and paste it and send it to everyone. But I'm actually teaching the introductory feminist course this fall. So I'm happy to share that syllabus, and maybe that will answer the question in sort of longer form. But in short form, if I had, you know, if I had to pick my favorite feminist, I guess, of color, I read a lot of bell hooks on almost like a daily basis. I return to her work. And Sarah Ahmed's work is really important to my own. So those are probably the two at the top of the list for me. But there's tons. I'm happy to send you that syllabus. Yes.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of requests in the chat for that syllabus, so we'll post a link to it and see if we can't get Dr. Puch's response to Mimi in the chat for all attendees. So some more, while some more questions are coming into the chat, and also, like I said, if you want to utilize your raise hand question and utilize audio and perhaps even video to ask your question, I think I will exercise the moderator's privilege and ask a question. I think for all the panelists, and some other folks may want to weigh in on this. I think this is one of the ongoing trajectories that I was referring to earlier, and I think specifically coming out of Dr. Lavina's talk this morning. But I'm wondering how all three panelists think about ways of approaching, demarcating, acknowledging the overlaps and the bleedings between some of the practices of care and self-care that we've been talking about, and then some of the discourse or the rhetoric or the, I think I'm inspired here by one of the MURAP scholars, Ariana Guzman, who presented last week about metalinguistics and the way that dialect is discussed within a novel by the characters. And here I'm thinking about not just the practices of care, but the discourse of care and how each become, multiple sites of cultural politics. It's kind of a blabby, open-ended prompt more than a question, but hopefully somebody can bail me out with some more cogent thoughts in any of those directions I gestured toward.
I don't know. I could jump in for a second, I guess. As you were talking, I was thinking about all of the fights that have been unfolding, especially on Twitter, but I think they're sort of everywhere, between parents and non-parents. And so, who has it harder during COVID? Is it people with young children at home, or, is it harder to be in isolation? And how caretaking and the politics of caretaking also, should people be allowed to send their children to daycare and expose daycare workers or nannies and other essential workers to the virus? And all of the sort of fighting that's unfolding right now between also educators who don't feel comfortable going back to work and parents who are saying, you need to go back to work and do your caretaking responsibilities so that we can go back to work and be productive. And so within all of these sort of ways that care is being framed right now, productivity is always there. And also sort of, it ends up creating a culture of infighting rather than looking at the big picture. Like, who's actually to blame for all of this? The fact that in the US, we don't have a government that is paying people to stay home. We don't have a government that's coming up with any effective way of dealing with the crisis, and is in fact, intentionally killing people, basically. So, and I think so care can be mobilized in that way to really sow divisions, and it can be very easily co-opted into rhetorics of productivity. And I just think it's extremely hard to disentangle them.
Dr. Hobart or Dr. Pucha, anything to add?
I guess I'll just jump in to say that I really agree with Dr. Neese's analysis of the tensions that have emerged around care as like the reproductive labor of care, right? And that reproductive labor extends to parenting, it extends to like all care work, right? Feeding is reproductive labor, birthing is reproductive labor, and all of these kinds of things can be looked at different types of labor with different types of conditions placed upon them, or they can be seen as a set of undervalued work that is kind of under crisis right now. I'll stop there. I have to admit, there was a mouse that appeared on my desk as Dr. Neese was talking, and I got a little bit terrified and distracted by it. So I think the mouse is gone.
I hope it is, but we'll understand if we hear any, squeals or if you disappear again, by all means. There's no need for, rodent heroism during a Zoom panel. Dr. Nguyen, our intrepid leader, has a question next. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you to all the panelists. I was really excited about this panel because I've always been uncomfortable with the term self-care, and I think that Dr. Pucha put it, helped me to understand why I felt discomfort with this, right? The way in which it's being peddled as narcissism, right? And I always thought there was a fine line between self-care and being self-indulgent. But when I hear about radical care and this idea of care as a part of the social justice movement, it resonates with me, and I think about self-care. It's more about self-preservation than self-care, right? The way in which it's being marketed as spas and manicures and pedicures and wine with your bubble bath, and so I guess it's more of a comment and maybe a question in that do we need to reconceptualize this term? If it means all of these different things, what does it actually mean? And so it's hard for me to hear, it being, and I agree with Dr. Pucha saying, self-care is peddling narcissism, but then on the other hand, hearing Angela Davis say self-care and healing are part of radical social justice. So I'm trying to understand the usage of self-care in these different contexts. And if it means both things, then what does it really mean? So I'll just lay it out there for the panelists.
I'll just jump in quickly and say that when Dr. Neese and I were thinking about drafting our piece on radical care, this was actually a really challenging component to work through, specifically because of the ways that care has kind of been brought into is used to talk about vapid modes of consumption, right? So, and this becomes done really easily because care is talking about the ways that care has been talked about in such a way that is meant to obstruct the forms of labor that underpin it, right? And so if you talk about care as this is indulgence or feeling or emotion, that obscures the silent part of care, which is care work, right? Care is labor. And because it has had this historical attachment to female labor, women's labor, it gets treated as emotion and not forms of work. And so I think that there's this really slippery thing that happens there that keeps pushing it into this overindulgence, the self-indulgence, instead of the work that it takes to sustain somebody or to sustain one's community.
And yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in just to sort of bring up that history again, in terms of self-care sort of originating from within care fields and medical fields of, sort of finding a way to cope with other people's trauma so that you can better serve them. And so that sort of older notion of what self-care meant, and it would be interesting actually to sort of trace the term self-care and when exactly specifically it became associated with this kind of narcissism. obviously Dr. Hobart and I noticed sort of the resurgence of self-care in that context after Trump's election, but it clearly is older than that. But I am wondering when exactly that shift happened. So that would be something interesting to track for anyone out there who wants to do that. But like why, when, and how did self-care become associated with these things that it actually wasn't meant to be associated with initially?
I have a preliminary answer sort of to that, because I've been tracking the word yoga and how it became associated with fitness cultures, especially, and women's fitness cultures in particular. And so a couple things. I think there is an interesting moment at the beginning of the 20th century where, like, sort of intersecting with women's lib, like early suffragette movements in particular, where women started adopting certain manners of dress and related dance styles even that allowed them to perform. I'm thinking in particular about like dancers based in New York who took on the very idea of modern dance comes out of Orientalist sort of approaches to movement vocabularies. And there is this tether that sort of takes like fitness and dance and modern dance, and it becomes sort of translated. And by the time you get to the 1940s, it's collapsed into beauty and like discourses of beauty and fitness and beauty and like really physique. And it really lands on the radar with Marilyn Monroe in the 1940s. So there are all of these promotional photographs of Marilyn Monroe doing yoga. And then from that moment on, I just started trying to figure out like where the blonde who does yoga, who also was sort of treated like a vapid character, right? So there's like a type of misogyny there in particular that is weaponized against these blonde, thin women. They become like an object of both desire and ridicule in equal measure. And you can sort of track that person into, I think, the contemporary moment. So like Suzanne Summers, Jane Fonda, they all belong to this genealogy. And now you have people like Gwyneth Paltrow who, you know, when I think of people who have taught women who have wealth, there's actually an entire Facebook group called Wealthy White Women Wellness, I think. And it's fascinating. It's also very distressing, but it's fascinating if you want to take a look. And it's sort of, it's equal parts parody, but also like tips for women who need to care for themselves in a society that doesn't otherwise really address their concerns, right? And so it's, my short answer is I think that self-care was an inherently gendered idea, and it had a lot to do with economic disparities, other types of sort of structural violence against women, but the way that it became folded into sort of a discourse of capitalist neoliberal ideologies, I think that might be a little bit more recent.
Yeah, I do want to echo Dr. Puch's point about like where capitalism underpins particular modes of self-care, right? What modes of self-care require one to like buy into a gym membership, to buy your bath bomb, to buy your, you know, whatever you need, your cute Audre Lorde quote pillow, right? Like what forms of expenditure are built into how self-care has been envisioned. And there are so many ways that there are so many modes of self-care that do not require that, but I think don't enter into like the neoliberal purview. So I'm thinking particularly like within the Native Hawaiian context, most recently, the encampments at the summit of Mauna Kea to stop the desecration of the island for the construction of the 30-meter telescope, right? Some of the most visible moments in that event where were, you know, activists who were chaining themselves to a cattle guard to prevent the construction trucks from moving up the mountain, right? They did this for about 24 hours. And part of the performance of this activism was having cultural practitioners coming in and giving massage right? Lomi Lomi is like a cultural practice. And so they were massaging the people chained to the cattle guard. They were singing together. They were preparing food and feeding culturally appropriate and nourishing foods to the people there. And so we can think about these realms of care and self-care that kind of elide capitalist imperatives, and how that might kind of expand our vision of what it looks like, and furthermore, like what kinds of liberatory potentials are built into it.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple more questions coming in, and I think they're all expansive ones for all the panelists, and they kind of build on Dr. Nguyen's question and some of the conversation going on. So I'll post them in the chat so everyone can see them. The first one is from Mimi Gorder, and we should probably stop and thank Mimi for serving as the coordinator for the conference here and doing such a great job, as many of us have come to learn over these past few months. Organizing a conference remotely is in a lot of ways even more challenging than trying to do it in person. So great job, and thank you, Mimi. And her question for all the panelists involves caring for the self and asking if it's dependent on individualism, and how people from communal cultures can not feel guilt when resting, for example, thinking about some of the examples that have been given so far, and what are the necessities about embracing individualism in order to practice effective self-care. So I'll see if any of the three panelists want to jump in first to address Mimi's question, and I'll post another question that showed up in the chat for the panelists.
I'll start quickly and then tap out. But that, just to continue on the example of Mauna Kea, right? Part of the way that people were talking about self-care in that context was part of the collective care, right? And so everybody was up there in these kind of really demanding conditions. And when you needed to kind of tap out, right, you tapped out, because everybody knew that, the longer you stayed up there, the longer that you were in it, the more strain you put upon yourself, the greater chance there would be that there would be a break in protocol, there would be a break in, somebody would get too tired and, lose their temper or kind of go against the core goals of that movement. And so people were encouraged to tap out when they needed to tap out and self-replenish and rejuvenate. And this is one of the reasons why they didn't have things like showers up at the camp, because they're like, you gotta go home. Like you can't start thinking this is your home. You gotta go home. You gotta take a shower. You gotta sleep in your own bed a couple of nights, because if you start thinking that this is where you live and the only thing that you do, somebody's gonna do something that kind of derails the core goals of the movement. And so I think that was a really interesting way to think about individual self-care as being in the interest of collective care.
So I'm seeing this second question that's sort of related to the bigger question about how we balance the individual versus or how we don't place those two in contrast or in tension with each other. I think the truth is that they are in tension with each other, right? This is sort of a thing we have to accept, that one of the great struggles of being human and being part of a society is finding a way to balance what is good for the individual with what is good for the whole. And I would argue that I live in Georgia right now, where our governor just banned a mandate on masks. So like, the idea that the individual and the collective are somehow in tension, I think, is particularly on display at the moment. And I mean, I appreciate this question about knowing what we know about, say, yoga or these forms of performative care. I think that the reality is, even the things that we find comforting are in themselves socially constructed, right? And so we have to have a recognition that there is a piece of our emotional attachment to things that is a product of a time and a place that we exist. So the fact that we respond to something in a certain way and our bodies respond to something in a certain way is also constructed. And like that recognition doesn't change the ethics of your behavior. And I find that one of the reasons I talk so much about the white racial frame is it allows folks to realize that the way that they've attached significance or meaning or care or comfort to certain practices might actually be a thing they can decolonize or dismantle for themselves if they start thinking about why they were taught to see something as beautiful. Where did they learn to experience something as comforting? And if you spend some time working through that and understanding that genealogy, it may not feel that way for you anymore. So then it's less about how can I do what I want to do? And it stops being about that question and becomes more about why do I think I want to do what I think I want to do? Which might be too existential of an answer for that question. I apologize if I went a little far, but I hear you. I cannot tell you how many white women have come to me and asked me, so is it okay to do yoga? I am not the person, I'm not the person you need to ask that question of. That is not, I'm not here to arbitrate or litigate that experience for you. But knowing what you might know now, does that change the way you feel about it? Maybe that's a better way to look at
it. That's great, and I think it is existential, right? And there's this kind of like, I don't know, like recursive, you know, I'm not, I don't know, ad infinitum, something like a feedback loop that kind of keeps getting to those questions and becomes very knotty. So I think that's perfectly appropriate. Thank you for that, Dr. Pucha. We had one more question in the queue, and maybe at this point, since we're approaching 3 o'clock Eastern time, I'll put out one final call for questions or comments while I direct you to Sophia's question in the chat, which is, as she says, something of a follow-up to Dr. Nguyen's question, but she's asking about decolonizing self-care, and in particular thinking of examples like belly dancing and yoga and white women engaging in them. You know, how, you know, do we have to throw it away? How reconstruct it? You know, what are some ways that we can approach this from a, you know, from a decolonizing perspective? That's a great question, Sophia. Yeah, and Sophia's pointing out that Dr. Pucha just spoke to that question with her last comments. So if anybody wants to elaborate on that question, please do. While I'll scan the panelists and participants looking for some raised hands or other questions in the chat. Dr. Neese, were you looking to jump in? I saw you were unmuted.
Maybe I unmuted myself at some point, but I think we can just sort of see if there are other questions.
Great. Now I'm muted. There we go. Yeah, I think we've hit all the questions and comments in the queue. I know I'm going to have some follow-ups for each of our panelists. And I think, so what we'll do is we'll hear from Victoria Day, another of our MURAP scholars this summer, who has a question for the panelists, asking for their thoughts on the rise of mindfulness and meditation as part of the new array of self-care practices.
Well, I guess I can kind of jump in on that one just because it's been on my mind. Through thinking about all of these different apps that are supposed to help you achieve a more mindful state. And I think the problem here is that it's become so commodified and tied to narratives around, sorry, that's my partner in the background, so tied to productivity narratives that it's really difficult to think about, you know, needing an app or an Apple Watch to actually physically tap you in order to remind you to breathe. And, you know, there are ways of sort of trying to achieve a more mindful state or slowing down or breathing to deal with anxiety that don't necessarily have to be plugged into an app, a device, or, you know, something that your employer is recommending that you do in order to be a better worker. But increasingly, it's very difficult to extricate it. And I have to say, actually, when I was postpartum, I went to a mommy mindfulness group just sort of as a research interest more than a thing that I really wanted to participate in. And it was all about, and of course, you know, the majority of the women in the room were like white tech workers who had maybe already taken up some level of quantified self and mindfulness app activity through their daily work lives, and we're now trying to apply it to motherhood. And it was a very strange thing to watch, and especially because within Silicon Valley circles, there's already been such a long history of appropriation of sort of Eastern meditation practices. And there are a lot of, you know, white dudes in Silicon Valley who think that they're like Zen Buddhists and appropriate that kind of knowledge and those practices. So I also see mindfulness as a kind of cachet within those circles that is an extension of longer histories of appropriation within Silicon Valley.
I just want to jump in by saying that that's a really important point, and to just underscore what Tammy was kind of prompting us to think about, which is that, like, to what ends are these modes of self-care recommended, right? For what purposes is mindfulness meditation recommended as self-care? Is it so that you can get back to work and continue to produce?
Dr. Pucha, anything to add to Victoria's question?
No, I'm thinking of, you know, when there was a brief period of time in the early 2000s after I finished college where I was a paralegal, and I worked for like a big, scary corporate law firm in Chicago. And they would bring in this like masseuse, this older Asian man who would give you like 20-minute massages on your lunch break, you know, so you could go back to work. And just out of curiosity, I was curious if they were still doing that at that law firm, and I looked it up, and now it's like a yoga meditation person. So I do think this belongs to a longer history of taking practices from the Orient, right, and providing them to workers in these corporatized environments, and making them feel like you care about them, or something, like as in that you care about your employees. Not saying that they don't, but I mean, let's be honest, like what they're trying to accomplish is for you to feel cared for, so you will be able to maintain satisfaction and do your job. So yeah, I think when I see things that include like mindfulness apps that are recommended by my employer, obviously I'm curious how that's become co-opted by like another type of language, that it just feels like an amoeba that's like gonna, you know, eat everything but tell you that you should keep working really hard, but here's a way to do it. So
we have about 5 minutes left, and I just posted what I think will have to be our final question for the panel. This one comes from Dr. Una, one of the Murab faculty mentors this summer, who, you know, given all of this discussion around race and gender, was zeroing in on one or a couple populations here and asking if any of the panelists can speak specifically to approaches that African American and Latinx men take towards some of these self-care practices and discourses.
I'll say that this is not my expertise, and I actually don't feel qualified to answer this question.
I second that. I can say very anecdotally, you know, just in the limited fieldwork environments that have included men, most of the fieldwork I've done has been overwhelmingly females, white women in particular. Was something I have noticed in looking at the way that yoga has been adopted as a care practice is that I've noticed that there are a number of carceral systems that have adopted yoga, And so I've seen these like ads that have photos of incarcerated Black men doing yoga. And I haven't done much research on it. It is a very complicated image just by itself. It's meant to signal something. I'm not sure what yet, but it did remind me of an image that was circulating this weekend of protesters. I think it was in DC, and it was a Black Lives Matter protest, and they were doing yoga. And so I think that, and I've seen versions of this. There was a protest at the border, at the Texas-Mexico border, that used similar imagery, sort of showed the practicing of yoga as like collective action in a way. But what made it a powerful image, I think, in the view of the white racial frame, was that it was predominantly Black and brown men's bodies who were now doing yoga. So I don't have much analysis to offer at the moment, but I do know that these are spaces that create disruption, sort of rupture in the larger narrative that we are having about sort of care and gender.
Well, and maybe there's a way also of linking self-care, especially within Black and Latinx communities, to social movements as well. So I'm thinking, and Dr. Hobart and I cite her work in our Radical Care piece, but Alondra Nelson's amazing book on the Black Panthers and all of their community-based programs around nourishment and medical care. So thinking about self-care also within that sort of radical activist context might be helpful. It's just a way of thinking about self-care in a slightly different way. So if we kind of pull back from the more sort of like wellness ideology, white ladies doing yoga, and like go back to more of like the Audre Lorde kind of self-care, then we can like, maybe there's a way to kind of reconfigure what self-care could mean for people who are marginalized.
Great, thank you. And all of the attendees, please join me again in thanking our three panelists for a fascinating conversation this afternoon. And I have to say, we have, I think, 17 minutes until our next keynote speaker from Melinda Maynard Lowry, professor of history at UNC. And I think, I'm afraid now I'm going to be very paralyzed as to what to do with myself for these next 17 minutes after listening to this conversation about some of the cultural politics of self-care. But I think that will be a healthy interval for me. Thank you all very much, and I'll turn it over briefly to Dr. Nguyen to close this session.
I just want to say that this panel reminds me of why I love MIRAP so much. It's the interdisciplinariness of this research, right? This is, as Dr. Una said, not a topic that he knew much about before this, and neither did I, but I learned so much today, and it's given me a lot to think about in my own work. So thank you to the panelists for sharing your thoughts and ideas with us. I'm going to check out Death Doulas and the Wealthy White Women Care Group, because I'm fascinated, because I really don't like Gwyneth Paltrow. And so, yes, so come back and join us for our session at 3:15. Our keynote speaker is going to talk about the shared past and present of Black and Indigenous people in the United States. So thank you all for being here, and see you in about 15 minutes. Bye.